Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to build this. This is a Pareto chart. Pareto charts are extremely useful when you have a big problem with many causes and you're not sure which of those causes to address first. In this video I'm going to show you how to build one in Tableau, why you might want to build one, as well as some common pitfalls that you want to avoid. Let's start with the basics. In the late 1800s, there's this Italian economist by the name of Vilfredo Pareto who noticed that 80% of Italy's wealth was controlled by just 20% of the people. Joseph Duran, who was this management consultant, soon realized that that 80-20 rule had so many different applications to so many different things besides wealth distribution. He popularized the notion of using the 80-20 rule to improve a business process or to start correcting the defects in a business product. Your company might find that 80% of its profits are driven by just 20% of its clients or customers. Alternatively, 80% of equipment failures might be linked to 20% of all causes. It's a handy rule of thumb that can be used in data analytics to efficiently focus on the high impact causes of the problem and to de-emphasize the insignificant ones, also known as the long tail factors. Now, we'll see later on that when building the Pareto chart, that split is not always going to be exactly 80-20, so do keep that in mind. All right, so to get started, we're going to go to a website called Kaggle.com. Kaggle.com is an excellent resource for free data sets. It's used a lot for practicing data science. You can also download those data sets and practice data visualization like we're going to do today. So I'm going to use this Causes of Death, Our World in Data. It shows data since 1990 through 2019 for all the countries of the world, and it quantifies all these deaths in these different categories like meningitis, cancer, fire, malaria, drowning, etc. So we're going to take that data and we're going to build a Pareto chart out of that. So I actually already have that data downloaded, so I'm going to go to Tableau Public. I'm going to load Tableau Public. I'm going to load that data set. This is a text file in CSV format. So I'm going to pull that open and I'm going to inspect our data set here. And when you're building a Pareto chart, it's going to be a lot easier for you if you orient this in a vertical format where you have rows for your deaths instead of a horizontal format where you've got all these columns. In this case, we have them in columns, or this horizontal format, but that's okay. It's actually a pretty easy fix. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these death categories, all these columns. I'm going to start with this first one, go all the way over here, hold down the Shift key, and then I'm going to right click. Now that I have all these highlighted, I'm going to right click, I'm going to click Pivot, and now all of those columns are now reoriented into rows. It's a very quick function. It's really easy for you to pivot that data in a pinch. So now we've got the data in the right format and we can proceed. Okay, so let's inspect the data even more here. We've got entity, which is our actually our country or our continent that we're interested in. It doesn't actually just look at countries, it also looks at continents. So I'm going to rename this to something that's more ambiguous. I'm going to make it area, not country or continent, but area. And it sounds a lot better than entity. Entity could mean anything. So we rename that to area. Pivot field names, what's that? Well, it's actually all of our death categories, but you'll notice that the data is prepared in a weird way. We have all of these prefixes that say deaths, hyphen, and then the type of death. I'm going to want to clean that up a little bit so that my Pareto chart will look a little bit better as we're going through this. So I'm going to duplicate this. Actually, I'm going to edit this duplicated field, and I'm going to create a replace function. So I'm going to replace that deaths hyphen with nothing so that it removes that from that string, that field of characters. So we start by referencing the pivot field names column, comma, and then I'm going to look for deaths hyphen, and then I'm going to we're going to call this, instead of pivot field names, we'll call it causes of death. Okay, so we do that. I'm going to put this right next door, and we're going to see that that deaths hyphen has been removed. But we still have this ending part of the death categories that also is kind of gibberish. It's dash sex, both, dash age, all ages, parentheses number. We want to get rid of that too. So I'm going to go back to that same calculation, causes of death. Now this thing is the thing that we're going to be using the second replace function on. So I'm going to put my second replace function in here. It's going to look to this field, and I'm just going to do a couple things first. These are going to be placeholders. It's going to replace the thing that we're about to specify with nothing here, and then we just need to type out the part that we want to trim out. So that's going to be hyphen sex, both, hyphen age, all ages, and then space number in parentheses. Once we do that, now you can see that all that junk has been removed. It looks a lot cleaner. We're ready to proceed. So I'm going to remove that. Causes of death looks good. Next, I'm going to look at my pivot field values. Pivot field values is just deaths here. I'm going to rename that, and I'm just going to call it deaths. And then now it looks a lot cleaner. But I don't want to look at all the countries of the world or all the continents or all of the years of the data. So first I'm going to narrow this down to, let's say, the past 5 years, for example. Okay, so let's make that like 2015 through 2019. All right, and then I'm going to organize this from greatest to least, so descending order. I'm going to refer to just one area. I'm going to refer to the United States. I'm going to filter this down to the United States. So we've got United States deaths by cause, and that's the years 2015 through 2019. So I'm just going to label that out right there. All right. So now what we want to do is I'm actually going to remove that text there, and I'm going to build a bar graph. So let me see here. I'm going to use deaths. I'm going to put this into columns, and now we've got the beginnings of a Pareto chart starting to form. I'm going to make this vertically oriented. Now we can see all these deaths in descending order. So this is where the fun begins. Now what we need to do is, in order for us to carve out this Pareto chart, to have that line or that area that tracks the cumulative percentage up to 80%, we're going to need to create a secondary axis. So I'm going to hold down the control key. I'm going to left click on this deaths field, and I'm going to drag it to the right. Then I'm going to right click, and I'm going to create a dual axis here. Now at this point what you want to do is you want to create a secondary calculation. I'm going to right click on the second green pill. I'm going to use the add table calculation, and I'm going to say that I want to have a running total. Okay, so we've got this, you'll notice that you start to see these bars kind of increasing a little bit. It's looking a little busy though, so I'm going to create a line for this instead. So now what it's doing is it's adding up all of these values. It's going here and it's saying, okay, add this to this, and then add it to this, and then add it to this, and you can see that line gradually climbing because it's adding all the stuff before it, and it gets gradually larger as it goes from left to right. But it's still not done yet. We need to convert that to a percentage. So to do that, I'm going to right click again. I'm going to edit that table calculation, and I'm going to add a secondary calculation. So I go there to click that add secondary calculation. Then I'm going to say that I want this to be percent of total. Okay, so now we're starting to see this Pareto chart take shape. What I like to do at this point is I like to do a lot of formatting to get this into the right settings and make it look pretty. So first I'm gonna bring over this filter that we have here that's right now just selected on the United States. Now you can kind of switch between all these different countries. And here's the really important thing that you're gonna do when you're building these Pareto charts. Now that this table calculation is built, we can actually make that become a calculation. If you just hold down the control key and drag it over here, that's going to give us something that we can use to just immediately create the Pareto chart in the future. I'm going to call that running cumulative percentage or something like that. Cumulative percentage, let's just call it. All right. So that's going to be really important later on. So now that we have that, what we can do is we can start coloring out the Pareto chart. We can, more importantly, we can drag that field that we just calculated and we can say 0.8 as the most that it can go through that cumulative percentage to trim it down to just the most important causes of death, the few causes that contribute to 80% of all deaths in the United States. We're looking at it now. This is the Pareto chart right here. I'm gonna stretch this out so that we can see it better. Actually, let me remove this for a second, and then I'm gonna drag this out a little bit. And we can do a couple things. We can blow up these causes of death here so that they're a little bit easier to read. Okay, so there's your cardiovascular diseases, neoplasms, chronic respiratory disease. I think this is actually a little bit too big, so I'm gonna adjust the size of that a little bit. Let's make that 12, and then let's unbold it. And I'm gonna put this into a dashboard so that it's a little bit easier to view in its final state. I'm gonna adjust this so that it's the right size for my computer. All right, and then now we have a couple more things we need to do. This line graph, I might choose to make that an area instead, and I'll bring down the opacity so it isn't blocking the actual bar graphs that much. And it looks kind of boring right now. There's not a lot of exciting stuff going on right now, so I'm going to add a coloration to this so that it looks more interesting. So I'm going to hold down the control key. I'm going to drag this deaths field to the color, and I'm going to drag that to this first area where it says some deaths, because that's the first axis. We don't want to drag it on the second axis, the one to the right, because the coloration would then affect this area here. All right, so now that we've done that, I'm going to edit the colors to be an orange gold. And it's looking pretty good, but there's still some things we could do to make this pop out a little bit. We could take these numbers of deaths and plop them right into the bar graph here. So that's what I'm gonna do next. So again, I'm gonna hold down the control key. I'm going to pull the sum of the deaths to the label, and then that's kind of hard to read, like 4,555,163. I'm just going to shorten that so that it's abbreviated to show millions instead. So right click on the label here, format, number, and then we'll make that millions. Okay, and then we'll make it bigger so it's easier to read. All right, so that's looking good. I like Tableau medium, so I'm gonna do that instead. And then maybe I will center that and see how that looks. Yeah, that's looking really good. Okay, and then one other thing I like to do is I like to have this title be a little bit dynamic to reflect what is selected in this filter over here. So to do that, I'm going to click here where United States was just a second ago. I'm going to put in the area here, so now it's dynamic. And I'm going to have like a sort of warm color here to denote sort of like this sense of urgency here, because we're talking about deaths after all. So United States deaths by cause 2015 through 2019. So now you can see as you switch between these different things, it retains that Pareto functionality, and you can also see that the country or the area that we're selecting updates now. So at this point it's looking pretty good. You could probably stop there and be pretty satisfied with the end product, but there's a lot of embellishments that I like to use in the Pareto chart to make it pop out a little bit more. So I'll show you that in a moment, but I just want to take a quick aside and explain why Pareto charts are so cool and how useful they can be, particularly in this example with leading causes of death. So looking at this Pareto chart, we see that in the United States, around 20% of the leading causes of death drive 80% of all deaths in the United States, and those are cardiovascular diseases, neoplasms, which is like cancer, for example, chronic respiratory diseases, Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, and then digestive diseases. We are able to emphasize the significant few versus the insignificant many. It shows that if you live in the United States, you're probably going to die from natural causes in old age, whereas you're far less likely to die being struck by lightning or a tortoise being dropped on your head by an eagle. At this point you might be thinking, well, duh, the United States is a developed country. Most people live to be old age, and so why bother making a Pareto chart for this? Well, great question. So I started with the United States as a stark contrast to the undeveloped countries. So let's turn to the country Chad, for example. So now that we changed to Chad, you can see that these leading causes of death change dramatically. Okay, so when you look at Chad, you can see that the leading causes of death become diarrheal diseases, low respiratory infections, neonatal disorders. We do see some of those cardiovascular diseases and neoplasms like in the United States example, but then you see tuberculosis, malaria, HIV and AIDS. These few causes of death, which drive 80% of all deaths in Chad, most of them have elements of prevention to them, but due to the scarcity of resources, shelter, basic living conditions, people in the undeveloped world are at constant threat of dying from diseases that you and I might not even think about very often. So from a public health perspective, if you wanted to ensure that more people live to old age, you could apply the Pareto principle to examine the significant few causes of death that drive 80% of the problem and see if they're due to preventable conditions. Then you could address those most significant issues to help drive life expectancy. Alright, so before we wrap things up, I just want to address a couple misconceptions. You'll see here that I added in this, what I call the XY split. So what we did when we built this Pareto chart is we set this cumulative percentage to be at most 80%. However, because of the nature of your data, it's not always going to exactly fit that 80-20 split. So what I've done here is I've built this visual to show you what that XY split is going to be precisely, just to illustrate this point that your data is probably not going to be exactly 80-20. So here we have 15%, 78% rather than 80-20. For Chad, it's actually close to 80-30. So misconception one, your data is not necessarily going to be 80-20. And then the other misconception to be aware of is that when we talk about this 80-20 rule, those numbers just by coincidence add up to 100. But when you're looking at your data, that XY split that you have is not necessarily going to add up to 100%. In this case, our data shows that for Chad, close to 30% of the causes of death contribute to 80% of all deaths in Chad. So they don't necessarily need to add up to 100%, and they don't necessarily need to fit precisely the 80-20 rule. It's just a rule of thumb. Now, what I like to do is I like to use that 80% as a starting point and then adjust things, either go up if I want to include more fields, or go down from that 80% if I want to include fewer fields. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, I'm going to wrap things up by showing you how I like to finalize the Pareto charts and present it on my dashboard. So if we want to adjust our 80% in this Pareto chart to a 90% or a 70%, to do that, we're going to need to build a parameter. So I'm going to go back to this sheet that contains this Pareto chart, and I'm going to build that now. So I'm going to go up to this arrow here. I'm going to create a parameter. This parameter is going to store a value of some sort. It's going to be kind of like a knob that we're going to adjust. The higher it goes, the more columns, or sorry, the more causes we are going to see contributing to that greater percentage. The lower we adjust it, the fewer causes of death we're going to see. We're going to start this at 0.8, and I'm going to call this Pareto adjustment or something like that. All right, so then I'm going to show that parameter here. 0.8 is the same as 80%, but I like to actually make it say 80%. So I'm going to adjust that here. So that's taken care of. So next we need to take that value and we need to put it into a calculation. So I'm going to create a calculated field, and that calculated field is going to be dragged to filters. Now remember this calculation here that we built earlier, this cumulative percentage? I'm going to drag that into this calculation, because remember what that is doing is it's looking at each of those causes of death, the leading causes of death, and it's taking the percentage that leading cause of death contributes to all of the deaths, and it's adding it up one by one as it goes from left to right. And it stops once it gets to 80%. That's what it's doing right now, but we're going to emulate that logic wrapped up in this calculation using this parameter here. So the way I'm going to do that is, while it's tracking that cumulative percentage, we're going to say that it needs to stop once it reaches that number there. So we're going to say cumulative percentage less than or equal to whatever that parameter, whatever the value it's storing there. So Pareto adjustment, and that should be good as is. All right, so I'm going to call that Pareto filter, and there you go. So then I'm going to drag this here, and now we set that to true. What this is doing, what that thing is doing, is it's basically saying if we are under this value here, then it's true, otherwise it's false. We're going to set that to true so that that cumulative percentage is always under this value here. And when I pull this off, this remains unchanged because we're now emulating that command to keep things under 80%. So I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to pull in that parameter, and you can see the functionality. If we increase that from 80% to 90%, we're now pulling in more causes of death because it has to pull in more to accommodate the 90% that we're looking now. Now let's go back to 80%. This is what it looked like before. Let's go down to 70% now. Now you can see fewer fields are being included. All right, so that's great. We now have the ability to adjust this Pareto chart to our heart's content. We can make it wider to capture more causes of death, to look at a greater percentage, or we can look at a smaller percentage and include fewer causes of death. So now that we've done that, I'll show you how I like to show these Pareto charts, my preferred way. So we're going to go back to this sheet holding our Pareto chart. I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to call this alternate Pareto 1. What I like to do is I like to tilt this on its side. So I'm going to click this button. I'm going to drag this down a little bit, and I'm going to drag that over here, and I'm going to do some row banding. I'm going to make this, I'm going to go to this paint bucket here, and I'm going to make that the header a little bit darker here with the row banding, but we don't want this in the pane, so I'm going to remove that. And that's looking pretty good. I'm gonna make this title a little bit better by formatting the title with a darker region here. I'm gonna copy and paste like a title that I actually was trying to think of in advance to make it look a little bit more snappy. Okay, so Chad hyphen significant few causes driving whatever percent of the deaths. And we're gonna replace that with this parameter here. Like, it's actually going to store this value. So you'll now see when I put 80% here, this climbs up to 80% as well. And I'm going to apply that same coloration that we have for the region so that they have consistent coloring. Okay, so that's looking good. Let's see, what else can we do? I'm going to remove that area because I don't think it really contributes much anymore. And then I'm going to remove these grid lines. So I'll go to Format, and I will, let's see, I'll go to the grid here, go to Columns, and remove the grid lines. We know that this is causes of death, so we don't need this indicator here. We know that this is death from the title, so we don't need that either. And also, we know that we can see these deaths here labeled clearly, so we don't need this axis at all. So that looks very good. What else can we do? If you wanted to, you could create another sort of view that branches off of this one. We're going to duplicate this, and I'm going to call this alternate Pareto 2. And let's say we wanted to include all of the causes of death, and we only wanted to color in the significant few causes and kind of desaturate the other colors to make those insignificant. So to do that, we would pull this off, and then I'm going to go back to this Pareto filter calculation that we just built. I'm going to duplicate it because it's going to have very similar logic that we can use for the coloration. So if that cumulative percentage is less than that parameter, then 1 else 0 end, and we'll call that Pareto coloration. All right, so there we go. I'll apply that. I'll drag that to our coloration. I'm going to lift that Pareto filter, and I'm going to make this a continuous field, and I'm going to make that color orange and gold. All right, and then lastly, I'm going to duplicate this dashboard. I'm going to pull in that new Pareto chart that we built. And let's make that fit the width here. I'm going to pull that out a little bit so it's easier to read. So it's looking fantastic. You can see clearly that these are the significant few versus the insignificant many. One final thing that you can do is you can add in a tooltip to make that even snappier by indicating what percentage do each of these things contribute individually. All right, so to do that, I'm going to borrow again this Pareto filter, and I'm going to duplicate this. I'll call that Pareto tooltip, and I'll say if that cumulative percentage is less than this Pareto adjustment, then, and then, actually no, we don't need to do that. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create a calculated field that says sum of deaths over the total sum of deaths. All right. Over the total sum of deaths. It doesn't like something here. Oh, it needs another parenthesis. All right, so percent contribution is what I'll call this. And then I'm going to drag that to the tooltip. I'm going to make that percent contribution a percentage. And then I'm going to, let's see here, causes of death, sum of deaths, and then I'm going to say percent contribution. And that's going to be That's going to be in the tooltip. So we're going to have, where is it? Okay, percent contribution. There we go, but it still doesn't show me this in the percentage format. There we go. Now we have it. All right, and then I will make that like this. All right, I think we have just about done everything that we can for this Pareto chart. It looks fantastic. Sorry, I'm focusing on my spelling here. Alternate Pareto. It looks fantastic. I don't think there's anything else that we can do to embellish this any further. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to end this tutorial, and thank you for sticking with me to the end. If you like these videos, feel free to leave any comments below and give it a thumbs up, subscribe, because I'm going to have way more videos in the future. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.